Ready. What's going on, guys? Welcome to Blending Strength and Conditioning with a BJJ practice. So we're going to go ahead and dive into quite a bit of information here on this. And the reason for that is because of the influx of strength conditioning programs that are being written for BJJ. And I had a couple conversations with some really good friends of mine and other mentors about the idea behind strength conditioning routines into a BJJ practice. And again, for me, if you've been following me for a while, you know that I'm not always looking to follow the crowd. It's more of a, it's more of a, it's more of a idea of differential. So I'm looking for a differential or the differences within the space or what is missing and what is the need that we are going to have to fill in the next few months to a year to 2 years. And I feel like I've always been on the forefront of that, especially when I worked with Softly. We were always around focusing on making sure that we were ahead of the curve. And I think that came more from me than it did anywhere else, was always looking at what's next and how do we improve that. So when we go and look at BJJ as a whole, what I've learned and what I've focused on here is going to be the idea of how do we go to implement this new stressor into our overarching practice of BJJ and lifestyle? Because realistically, a strength conditioning routine is just an extra stressor put on top of everything else you do. And if you are someone who works in the tactical professional realm, who is a professional coach who coaches all the time and has to train, or if you're just a 9 to 5 individual who likes to train for fun and who wants to be more of a professional exerciser, when we start implementing new volume and new loads and new intensities, we have to start managing that intensity and that stress. So this is kind of what I'm actually going to be highlighting and talking about, is this idea of how do we go ahead and manage our new training stimulus, which is going to be a strength conditioning routine, into it. Now, that is a big part into why we are focusing on talking about this self-monitoring training load system. So I'm going to go ahead and get other people, go ahead and get in and get set up real quick. And we'll go from there. People were texting me right now to get into the thing. I didn't realize that this was going to be an email. Hold on, guys. Let me just get this out real quick for you guys. Paste. All right, sweet. So I'm going to go and open the share screen for you guys. That's not it. Where's it at? Sorry, guys. This is being weird. I appreciate your time. I swear I practiced getting all this set up before the class. And of course, it doesn't mess with me. All right, sure. Cool. All right, so you guys can see the screen. I'm going to go ahead and blow this up a little bit so we can see it. Cool. All right. So when it comes down to talking about blending strength conditioning with a BJJ practice, I'm going to be presenting it. I do have a tactical strength conditioning facilitators, as well as a bachelor in science and sports psychologist, emphasized with performance psychology. Now, I'm currently working on getting my master's in art, emphasize on English and education. So this is the reason why I'm running a lot with the idea of doing educational classes and in that headspace. So again, mission for the class: learn how to incorporate a strength conditioning routine into a BJJ martial arts practice, utilizing a self-monitoring training load system. So this method will ensure that your physically and mental stress are taken into account. And that's a really big piece here that I think we tend to forget, is actually taking in this type of stress and this new load that we are putting onto the system. I understand that we're always training, we're always doing something, and there's always external stressors coming in, but we also have to take into effect our internal stressors at a full grasp of what's really going on when it comes to training these two different styles. And again, many people would say it's probably not a style of training, it's an approach or a method. It really doesn't matter. The idea is stress, and our body only knows stress. So how do we go ahead and manage and manipulate and actually recover from the stress that we're adding on? So what are we exploring? So this is actually going to be a two-part series. So this first one's going to be talking about perspective on strength training and BJJ. where we're going to actually dive in together as a discussion. So we're going to go ahead and have you guys come up, and we're going to talk a little about what are we doing with a BJJ practice and why are we adding in strength conditioning. From there, we're going to go and explore the reasons for engaging in strength training, as well as have another quick discussion as well. And then from there, get a better understanding of individual needs. From there, we'll also learn what is the self-monitoring training load system and how do we use it and how do we apply it to ourselves. And if you are an athlete who's worked with me in the past or currently working with me, you know that I implement this training load system into your remote programming already, because it allows for me to go ahead and navigate and be a little bit more precise with what I'm doing when I'm actually increasing or decreasing volume or increasing progressions. From there, we're going to talk a little about what is the high-low continuum. Now, this is something that I've kind of put together over the past few years. And when you look at it, you see it, you're going to be like, I've seen something like that before. And again, no new idea is a brand new idea. It is a innovation of other ideas that have come together. So if you've heard of the high-low method, and we've heard of, power output all the way down to the far end of our power and endurance aspect of a continuum, you see that kind of looks very similar. And then we're going to go and talk about why the regeneration engine and what is the regeneration engine. I think this is something a lot of people don't talk about a lot. And I think this is something that I want to go ahead and fill the gap with, because again, when we go down that rabbit hole, you'll understand why it is we are focusing on the regeneration engine. Second from that, how do we improve recovery rate? That's a conversation that we'll have together, and how do we go ahead and navigate that, especially from an individual's needs perspective and external lifestyle factors. So perspective, all right. If you and I walked into a room at the same time, we would see it differently than each other. I actually took this idea, or at least this approach, from the writing world and the creative writing world. And the reason for that was, whenever someone reads a book, what they're reading is not always going to be the same thing that other person's going to go ahead and take in. And if you read the same book over and over again every 6 months, you're going to pick up something new. And the same thing happens here when we talk about perspective and the way we look at the world and our lens in terms of how we actually approach it and how we navigate through it. So here, what I want to talk about is perspective on why is it that we want to go ahead and put a strength conditioning routine into a BJJ practice. Now, I've had this conversation actually with my buddy Ben. He's a black belt. And I'm going to actually have him jump in and kind of share a little bit of what he looks at when it comes to his training. And then we have other individuals in here who have trained underneath me, as well as partake in strength conditioning and jiu-jitsu. And again, what is it that we're looking for when it comes into that? So Ben, if you want to jump on, you can turn off your mic, dude. You can jump on and talk a little about that. Let's open the conversation with that in terms of you sharing, what it is that you utilize for strength conditioning compared to what others would utilize from a strength conditioning perspective, especially as a black belt who is already at that level and continuing moving forward.
Yeah, man. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I got you.
Yeah. So I got a lot of history under the bar. And so I know you and I have talked about this before, but that's not something I focus on when it comes to applying this across the spectrum or like interdiscipline, switching it over from just being in shape to sport specific application, right? So the way I utilize this for jujitsu is mostly in position, looking at strength as being something that I have in position. So anything that requires me to hold something static. So like a simple example would be like like this is a little extreme, but some sort of like leg clamshell, right? So my ability to hold my knees apart from each other for a reasonable amount of time. Or hold something in like a half squat or anything where it's not as simple as like up and down under a barbell, right? So I know like one of the things that our friend Michael talked about one time was grabbing a 150-pound or 200-pound ball and holding it on your chest in like a rack position, and then squatting as slow as you can, like at like stupid slow, right? And so what you'll find through that range of motion, there is a point within position that you are weak at. And so anything that targets that sort of thing is normally what I gravitate to. Anything that requires stability. So maybe instead of like a bench, it'd be like a single arm something or other, something that requires your arm by itself to stabilize within the shoulder. Also, anything else that requires like both concentric and eccentric movement. So before I really got into jiu-jitsu, like I've always grappled, but climbing was my discipline. So there was a lot of squeezing and things that way of closing the hand. So now I do a lot of like opening the hand under resistance. For shoulders and joints, anything extended range of motion, same thing, not just range of motion, but once you get out into the extended positions, holding against resistance or pulling against resistance, and then a little bit of weight work. Obviously, that's usually very light, but weight work within those extended positions. Uh, Everything now that I look at, it's less about PRing, it's more about longevity and injury prevention. Trying to stay healthy longer. If I can. Sometimes things go quick, and the stronger my joint is in the position, like the little bit more time I have to tap and save the shoulder kind of deal. Um, but just the sport kind of beats up on you. It kind of pulls you into those extended positions. So that's where I really look to try to like injury prevention and prolonging life expectancy of the joint.
Yeah, no, totally. So I think that's one piece that I feel that's missing in the sport of jiu-jitsu is this idea of how do we go ahead and decrease injury rate or injury risk. For example, I know Anthony's in, he's 7 years over at Legions, and he's been doing strength conditioning training. Anthony, I'd like to hear your perspective, dude, on how you approach strength conditioning with BJJ, especially with you helping out teaching, as well as obviously being in the sport for such a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate you having me on here. Very similar. I've been training for about 7 years. I started coaching quite a bit and training a lot more. So my strength and conditioning sessions decreased during the week as my BJJ increased, as you were talking about, trying to maintain a good level of intensity and stress throughout the week. So for me, a lot of it is rotational core work. I think that's super important, especially in jiu-jitsu, and then a lot of injury prevention. I do a lot of mobility, and range of motion strengthening, just to try to help the knees, the ankles, the shoulders, to prevent, or the best that I could prevent, injuries while I'm training. A lot of kettlebell work, a lot of single arm, single leg work. Once in a while, I get under the barbell, but for me personally, I found the most success with higher reps, almost like a hypertrophy programming for the muscle endurance. And I feel like it's a good balance throughout the week with training and strength conditioning. I don't feel either way I'm too overworked, and I can still get the volume of training that I'm doing.
Nice, dude. Cool. So that's a big piece there, right? Again, so this is going to tie into the idea of individual needs. You've already heard Ben talk about it. These are the things that I focus on to make sure that my BJJ practice is at this level. Same thing with Anthony. Okay, these are the things that I need to do to maintain my ability to perform on the mat. Thanks, Anthony. I appreciate you sharing that. Matt, you are one of the owners over at Crown BJJ, dude. We've actually got to work together last year, leading you into Masters Worlds. And I'd like to go ahead and say Matt is a big time linebacker or big old wrestler. He's like, what, 240 pounds, brother? You're like 6'2", 6'3". Am I wrong on that?
Oh man, talk to me like I'm on paper. Sounds good though.
One thing cool about Matt and I was the individual aspect that it wasn't that he needed to get stronger. He needed to learn how to be more athletic and move a certain way that allowed for him not to get injured with when he's actually fighting at that level. And what was really cool, man, and what I got to see at that Masters World was your athleticism, your ability to balance on one leg, your ability to jump around, your ability to play guard, your ability to play top position for being such a big dude, right? And I think that's the big piece here. And the individuals who have been doing jiu-jitsu longer than I have understand that, and you guys can probably chime in on this, but having a big man move like a lumber dude is very, very good. And it surprises a lot of big people, which makes you that much better on the mat. And I think we did that really well for you, man. I think you've continued doing that, especially when I saw you fight over at it was Nationals, I believe, and you took first as well in that. You did a really good job of being able to move really fluidly and didn't have really no sticking points. And I guess we see that a lot in jiu-jitsu when we get down into that bottom squat position, or if we're in like a very adductor like length with that knee being out and you're in one leg position like a Cossack squat, or if you're in your back trying to bridge. So Matt, talk a little about your perspective and what you've done over the past year to kind of change your strength conditioning to blend into your BJJ practice.
Yeah, I mean, you, George, really brought a lot of light to my practice. I mean, playing football for so long, it was just very structural in Olympic lifts and just movement forward. So really getting out of my own way was just a different way to think. Obviously, the movement, the patterns, just moving like an athlete, like an animal, has changed kind of my training a lot, and actually makes me a lot more adaptable to, getting around injuries and not being so strong in certain positions and actually being able to do different things. So the perspective of what I've done before from football has completely changed. I think movement is more important than strength in a lot of different ways. I came into jiu-jitsu and it was just kind of ground and pound, smash and pass, and that was just kind of my way of doing things. And then as I've been working with you, I've really had to change my game and using more of my athleticism and looking at smaller athletes really train in a different way and fashion. And I think speed kills all. So your training's been phenomenal. I love what we do and what you showed me how to move better. It's completely changed my perspective, and trying to incorporate it to other athletes that are at our gym that are still in the old methodologies of bench press and squat and power clean as much as you can. It just doesn't transfer onto the mat, in my opinion.
Yeah, man, and there's a place for it, I think, and that's something that I want to, the next, I guess, part 2 would be talking about is the periodization of how do we get someone from point A to a competition, and how do we go ahead and blend through that. But that's a really good point, is like taking these newer athletes who are potentially coming from all types of walks of life. We know that everyone, I mean, we can go ahead and throw out as many different people that come into BJJ and honestly don't have no strength conditioning background, have no real training history. So the idea here is to really develop the idea of movement literacy. And I've talked about that in the past, and I'm going to go ahead and talk about that here in a little bit. But how about you, Phil? You have anything, bro, that you want to share, or Ryan, you guys want to share anything about BJJ or strength training in general? Idea of this is just stress, and we work with and train, and we do lots of different things. So you guys can throw anything in. If not, I'll move on to the next slide.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I approach it, I just look at it from 3 different buckets of durability, ability to recover, and then an exploration and strengthening of the ranges of the sport. And I look at, I take those 3 buckets and I look at the athlete and derive the training from there.
Nice, dude. Yeah. Phil, you have anything, buddy? Word. All right, moving on. He's kidding. Cool. All right, moving on, guys. Sweet. So perspective, we all kind of talked a bit about that. The next thing we're going to go and talk about is going to be reasons for strength conditioning in a BJJ practice. So if you look at this in order of precedence, and the idea for this is improving quality of life, identify individual needs, increase physical and mental conditioning, develop athleticism, decrease injury risk, improving your rate of recovery, and improving competition performance. So over the past year, and realistically, I've been working with combat athletes for over a decade, and it's been more on a one-on-one remote coaching process. I've worked with individuals at the black belt level. I've worked with individuals down to white, to the blue, to the purple, to the brown, and all the way up in a very individual manner. And that has allowed me to really understand and figure out what it is that these individuals need. And most of the times it's going to come down to the very first one, is improving quality of life. Now, we understand that, when we go into a BJJ class, most of the times it's about an hour. It's about 30 minutes of skill technique work, and then you get about 30 minutes of rolling. I've been in a class before where it's 90 minutes of actually 30 minutes of technique work to 45 minutes of technique work, and then 45 minutes of conditioning in terms of sparring and practicing what we learn. Now, if we do too much jiu-jitsu, right? If we do too much of anything, it will decrease our quality of life. Why? Because we're probably not recovering properly, we're not eating well, our hydration's down, or we're potentially setting ourselves up for injury. Now, this is another thing that I've actually been hitting on, and something I've been talking with the pro team over at Del Mar Jiu-Jitsu Club, especially with Felipe, Mel, and Leticia, is this idea of neurological fatigue. And I actually noticed this a lot more from the endurance world. So running ultra marathon races and actually training for ultra marathon races. And what I mean by that is your ability to respond to unknown stimulus over time slows down when we start to see our quality of life decrease, or when we start to see that we're overtrained. What happens is our ability to go ahead and react to certain types of movements or whatnot end up decreasing, because of the fact that neurological fatigue has now been increasing, and it's no longer at its low where we're able to perform at that highest level. So again, when we talk about quality of life, we have to understand that it's not just the physical conditioning, but it's also the mental conditioning that we have to go ahead and improve. And we know that jiu-jitsu is a game of survival. And if we can go ahead and learn how to survive outside of the mat, I'm pretty sure we can learn how to survive on the mat. Next would be identifying are identifying individual needs. And what I mean by identifying individual needs, we go ahead and look at this from a biomechanics standpoint, as well as a physiological response or a standpoint as well. And what that is we talked a little bit about that in perspective. We talked about movement quality, athleticism. We talked about holding positions better. We talked about managing stress. We talked about rotation. We talked about throwing in different types of unilateral development. We talked about figuring out durability, transferability. And these are all things that actually go into individual needs. And I think that's a big piece that we tend to forget here because of the fact that we've become such a very huge group tank of thinking, meaning that everyone's just trying to copy everyone else. And we end up forgetting that humans need individuality. And if we don't have individuality applied to them, then we're not going to see individuals reach their true potential. And I think that's where I come into play here is that, again, working with individuals, I'm not just being like, hey, you're going to do these same exact movements, right? No, it's like, hey, let's go ahead and look at what you need to work on. Is your movement quality there? Is your movement variability high? Is your movement patterns where you need it to be to where it does decrease injury? How is your resting heart rate? How's your aerobic system? There's a lot of things that come into play. How's your sleep? How's your eating? Even bigger, what's the support system outside of your BJJ practice and your strength conditioning practice? Is there support there from family and friends to allow for you to go ahead and do this stuff without feeling like you're being held back because you're taking away from other people? These are all things that we have to take in consideration. And that is something really big that again, I think that the BJJ world is really missing, right? Because we teach in this group setting. And I've been talking with Ben a lot, like you heard him earlier. He's very big on this individual approach. What is it you need to work on from a technical and skill standpoint? And once you get that understanding, start practicing that and then move on to the next skills and techniques that you can apply. So we start going back and forth. And the way I like to look at it is to think about it as a soundboard or however you want to look at it. And we're just increasing certain knobs to go ahead and have the right balance for you there. Now, the next one, increase physical and mental conditioning. So for the longest time, working with the tactical professional world, we were really emphasizing the idea of improving physical conditioning, physical fitness, physical endurance, physical strength. But we forgot that the mental conditioning is really what matters. And mental conditioning is ultimately the ability to have attention to fight for X amount of rounds or X amount of minutes or multiple different matches throughout a weekend. So something I said last year, I was over at the nonprofit symposium and I looked at BJJ, especially when we go into a world's competition where you're fighting potentially 2 days to 3 days. BJJ is an ultra endurance event. And that sounds funny. And everyone's like, wait a minute, how is that possible? Well, you got to understand that the mental conditioning aspect of this, you're on for 24 to 48 hours, meaning that you have to be working. You have to be doing all the right things possible to allow for you to exceed in terms of fulfilling your goals. And that was something really big that we talked about going into Worlds with Felipe, Andrew, and Mel and Leticio, was this idea of like, we need to do the very small things really well after the fights and before the fights and making sure that we're recovering between the fights. That means if we're taking naps, that means that we're allowing for our headspace to recover so that we can put that same attention back down. Because again, I'm pretty sure some of us who have competed in BJJ, especially you're fighting 3, 4, 5 matches within a day or 2 day period, when you get to that 3rd, 4th, or 5th match, mentally, you're kind of exhausted. And this is the same feeling that I've gotten when I'm working with tactical professionals or I'm working myself, doing long endurance events, is that mental fatigue starts to kick in. So how do we increase that physical and mental conditioning? That comes to being able to be very intentful and have the attention span to actually be doing your sport. And that just comes from you being able to be very, very in tune with what's going on. And that can be utilized through certain types of training protocols. That can be utilized through mental visualization, meditation. That can be through swimming, running, all those types of things. Again, all we're doing is getting used to being inside our head and having those positive conversations and feedback loops that are positive to allow for you to move forward. Next, developing athleticism. So when we talk about developing athleticism is probably one of the biggest pieces here, right? Because again, we have a lot of walks of life coming into the BJJ world, and a lot of them don't have any athletic background. So we want to go and talk about how do we improve that? Well, that means that they need to go ahead and look at it they need to be able to run, jump, throw, skip, sprint, lift weights, move like an animal, like Matt said. Again, being able to move in all directions. And this idea that Ryan and I had a few months back was this idea of an omnidirectional individual or omnidirectional human being, meaning that we can move in all directions, forward, backwards, left, right, in a diagonal, however else. And honestly, thinking you have eyes on the back of your head, you're able to see everything in a 360-degree headspace and perspective. Now, decreasing injury rate. Again, this ties all into it. How do we go ahead and decrease injury rate? Well, we have to slow the individual down, meaning that we have to improve movement quality, movement efficiency, movement patterns, and movement variability. If we know that that is a limitation in someone's movement practice, and when I say movement practice, just ask someone to do some kind of movement flow and look at how they move. Do they have issues getting into certain positions, even in that low stress setting? Because when we put them into a high stress setting, what ends up happening, we start to see that movement variability, movement efficiency, movement variability, patterns and movement quality start to break down, which then obviously leads to injury. So decreasing injury rate is improving movement patterns, and we'll talk about that here coming up. And improving recovery rate, that's really one of those things where, again, doing the small things outside of your BJJ practice or your strength conditioning practice really matters. That means sleeping correctly. That means having a practice of going to bed and having a practice of waking up and enabling the mind. That means your nutrition, your hydration's on point, making sure you're understanding how to manage heart health, understanding how to manage stress, emotional well-being, as well as psychological well-being on top of that. So again, a lot of those things come into play isn't from specifically the strength conditioning program or the BJJ practice. It has to do with 90% of what you're doing outside of that. Now, we can utilize strength conditioning protocols and progressions, and we can utilize BJJ skill development and tactic development and sessions like that to improve recovery rate, meaning that we're not sending it every single time we're on the mat or in the gym. Now, lastly, improving competition performance. That's something that a lot of people like to do. Like, it's compete, it's just part of the sport, and it's kind of how we do it. So how do we improve competition performance? A lot of people will talk about it coming from the idea that, hey, it's based around just getting them faster, stronger, more powerful, more enduring, more durable, have the transferability and longevity. I think that's not the big piece there. I think what the piece is exposing someone to that stressor of how to compete at that level, meaning that you have to sprinkle in those high intensity dosing sessions to allow for someone to go ahead and have the ability to mentally and physically fight at their true potential when it actually counts. Again, I call it the sniper mentality. I use this with a lot of my individuals depending on what sport they're in. But as a sniper, when you're carrying, your long rifle and your ruck and you're doing some stalking and you have all that stuff, you only have about 5 rounds inside your magazine in that sniper plus an M4 most of the times, if that's what you're doing. And you can't send all 5 rounds down at one time, because if you do, you literally are now combat ineffective. So the idea is to send those rounds when it matters. And I think that's the idea and the theory that I have been trying to share with a lot of athletes and the ones that I work with closely is saving those rounds for when it matters. So for example, Felipe Andrew competed last year over like 70 something fights, almost close to 80 fights. He lost only 2 fights in that whole time period and only got injured just recently. And when I say injured, he just had an ankle lock or heel lock really bad on him by, who was it? Oh, my mind went blank. My mind just went blank. His OG, Raj, my mind went blank. I'm sorry, guys. He's probably going to hate me for this, but he got put into a heel lock and it messed up his ankle. So we've had to focus on recovering that. But over the past year, what we really focused on was looking at how do we go ahead and make him stronger in terms of holding positions and towards the game he was playing. And the same thing with Mel. How do we get her to move better? The same thing with Leticia. We needed to fix and mentally get her to fight in terms of the mental headspace. So we had to create, mental positive words that made her actually fight and do those things. With Felipe, it was more of like, how do we get you to move better and hold positions better without injuring yourself? So again, a lot of that comes into play when it comes to improving competition performance. So now, talking about individual needs engine. So when we talk about individual needs engine, we go ahead and talk about biomechanics. And the reason for that is because the positions that we get put in, some of us get smashed, our legs are over our head, our toes are touching the ground while our head's still on the floor. So we're getting put into this pancake. We might be in a half guard position where we got to focus on really good adductor strength as well as focusing on glute strength for being pushed in. We got to talk about internal and external range of motions, both in the shoulders and in the hips and in the ankle. All of those things come into play. So when we go and look at it, I have this approach where I call it the 4M practice, and it's going to be these 4 M's, which is the movement patterns, movement quality, movement efficiency, and movement variability. And the way I like to break that down is I reverse engineer it. Movement variability in pretty much short in a sentence is your ability to maintain a certain movement over multiple repetitions. So let's go ahead and take I'm going to use a CrossFitter just so you guys we can use whoever we want to put that person. Let's say we asked them to do 50 thrusters at 95 pounds, 65 for ladies. I'm going to go ahead and watch them do those 50 thrusters. And I'm going to make a note when it is that they start to break down in terms of movement. Is their heels coming off the ground? Is their knees caving in? Is the thoracic extension breaking? Because then from there, I can look at, okay, movement variability broke at, let's say, rep 30, and that individual had to struggle to get through it. So let's go and take that same, idea and put it to a BJJ athlete. And this is something where we can look at our movement quality and our movement variability on the mat. As we continue to roll multiple times, do we see that our movement patterns, our movement efficiency, our movement quality actually start to break down? The same idea here is movement variability actually matters. And that's something we talked about from perspective, was the idea that, hey, we need to increase how we move. We need to make sure that the way that we move from an efficiency standpoint means that we're not losing as much energy. Because again, the goal is maintaining and managing energy throughout multiple fights and multiple rounds when we are sparring or fighting at a competition level. And then movement variability, the better variability that I have to move, the better I'm going to be on the mat when I'm further in those fights and further in that competition. And I like to use this idea is if you go back and look at the fights over the weekend and look at Felipe and Mel, and you'll notice that their movement quality, movement efficiency, and movement patterns and movement variability did not decrease whatsoever across the board. They actually were able to fight the same exact way they fought the first match all the way to their world championship match. And that there for me was a big piece, meaning that I did a really good job and they did a really good job of being able to stay fluid and move and manage energy as a whole over the multiple day weekend. Now, the next piece, physiological responses are the engine that we can look at from there. So the cardiovascular system. Cardiovascular system is a really big piece, and that's something we can dive down into like crazy. And I think I'll probably do another class on exactly what that is, because there is energy systems to go ahead and strengthen the heart, strengthen how our body recovers, strengthen how our body produces power output, and how it has the ability to do it multiple times, right? How do we recover fast enough to get back into the fight, to be able to fight at that high level again? And the cardiovascular system is a really big piece in that, as well as moving into the respiratory system. And the respiratory system is one of those things that allows for us to go ahead and get the oxygen into the system to go ahead and get the heart rate back down as quickly as possible, so that then we can go ahead and continue performing. And that respiratory system obviously is going to be around your lungs, being able to consume as much oxygen as possible and then get it out of the system and back in. Again, there's a lot of things that come into play when it looks at the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system. Next is going to be energy levels. All right. Something we talked about a couple of weeks ago was the gut, and how the gut actually drives how we are going to be able to perform. Why? Because it's attached to the brain as well as the heart. So if we're eating like crap, we're not going to have the energy levels to sustain our ability to maintain a strength conditioning routine or maintain a BJJ practice. So again, we are what we eat. We hear that all the time, but if we're having a really crappy diet, eating McDonald's, donuts, Monsters, and we're putting in a bunch of crazy stuff into our belly, what ends up happening is it actually decreases our ability to recover. Right. And that's the thing here, the ability to bring energy to the mat or bring energy to our training session from a strength conditioning perspective. And the same idea here is if we're doing a strength conditioning session first, we might want to eat so that we can handle the training load that we're going under. And then we need to eat again to get ready for a BJJ practice. The same thing happens with we do BJJ first. We need to eat prior so that we can go ahead and have the energy during, and then we have to eat afterwards so that we have the energy to get ready and recover for the strength conditioning session. Now, that is a big piece there, and we can talk about nutrition on another time. But again, when we look at nutrition and the energy levels, understand that the higher quality foods, the more nutrient type foods we get into our systems, the more energy we're going to have and the faster we'll recover. And we put less stress on the gut, meaning that we have higher energy performance. Now, the last piece here is going to be nervous system. Now, the nervous system is a big piece, and this is something that I have really taken into account, especially as I got further into ultra endurance back in 2017 and 16 and 18 and continue training. Is something I do with a lot of individuals right now, and have an athlete who is doing back-to-back 100Ks within like a 4 to 6 week block. And realistically, it's not that we're focusing on letting her recover between a physical standpoint. It's more of letting her nervous system recover from being on for anywhere 16 to 20 hours every 4 to 6 weeks. So that's a big piece. It's the same idea if we have someone who is fighting every month, say Felipe Andrew, or if we have someone who is training 4 to 5 days a week in jiu-jitsu and doing 2 to 3 days of strength conditioning as well inside of that, we have to let the nervous system recover so that we can come back and actually maintain that high level of performance week in and week out. Now that comes into managing and understanding stress. One week might be very high volume, high intensity and some high load stuff. And the next week might need to be low intensity, low volume, and doing that so that we allow ourselves to go ahead and recover and actually let the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, and the gut do what it needs to do. So again, the nervous system is a big piece here, and we can talk about the parasympathetic state and the sympathetic state and how those two actually balance out and work with each other. But a lot of times what happens is we end up having a very unbalanced nervous system, which causes us not to recover fast enough. And that's due to lifestyle factors. We've talked about that before in the individual needs aspect. But again, if we're not eating, sleeping, if we're not hydrating properly, if we're not managing our heart properly, if we're not managing stress, a lot of that can fill the cup and actually lead us to an overfilled cup of stress, leading us to overtraining and potentially burnout. And we see it across the board in everything, not just in BJJ. So before I move on, do we have any questions what I've talked about so far? Do we want to go ahead and dive down a little bit of what we've covered from individual needs engine, as well as, you know, the reasons for BJJ practice? Anybody want to share their thoughts on it? No? All right, cool. Moving on. All right, so self-monitoring training load system. This is something that I have taken from, there's some scientific research on this. It's just a self-load monitoring training system. We're using rate of perceived exertion times training time equals number of units of training load. You can find this in the NSCA CSCS book. You can find this in the TSAC books. You can find this pretty much anywhere. And the idea for this is to go ahead and develop more of a feeling awareness. So this is where I'm now going to go ahead and come into play. It was like, I understand we wear wearables. I understand we have whoops. I understand that some people train with heart rate monitors on for jiu-jitsu and as well as strength conditioning. And that's all great. And those are all great things to utilize. But realistically, I like to talk a lot about this idea of feeling awareness, right? So consciousness is more of a feeling awareness than it is a thinking awareness. So what I've learned and I've utilized now over the past year, especially with the pro team, is whenever they come to me, right? My first question is, how are you feeling? Especially if they have had a BJJ session already. How are you feeling? That is my main question. What are you feeling like? How was your training practice? How long did you train for? And in my head, I can put together where they're at. And then from there, I can manage training load when they come in and train with me. Now, we've actually flip-flopped it this new year after Worlds, and we're training in the morning now, and then let them do their BJJ practice to where they have a longer rest period in the back end. Now, that allows me to go ahead and push that system a little bit more, but realistically still keeping the insights that they still have to go do BJJ at a very high level. They're training for 90 minutes in a competition setting. So I have to make sure that they're prime and ready to go and not completely taxed and not having the ability to train. So the way we do that is, again, utilizing this training load system. And for everyone who's never used this before, and if you have, it's really simple. And the way you go ahead and apply it is, it's going to be an RPE scale, all right, system. And it's going to be 1, which is low stress, meaning that I didn't work at all. It was recovery. It was really easy. 10 is going to be maximum effort. Now, if you've heard of the bog score system or the scale, it goes from 6 to 20. I just brought this down to keep it a little bit more easier to kind of follow along. So again, 1 to 10. Next, training time. How long did you train for? And this comes down into the idea of the time that we're in resistance. So with the GAS model, the general adaptation syndrome model, what we see with that is we have a counter shock phase, we fall into resistance. And then when we come out of that resistance phase, we go into exhaustion phase. And then we have to start doing things to get us back into that recovery phase and back to homeostasis to get ready to train again. So the idea here is, how long are we training for? So if your training session from a BJJ standpoint or a strength conditioning session was a 5, meaning that's the intensity that you perceived it to be, and you trained for 60 minutes, well, that's your total number of units. That's how much load did you perceive that training session to be. Now, what ends up happening is you might go ahead and actually play around with this right now. And if you've trained today, or if you've done other sessions throughout the week, you can apply this and see where you're at. And a lot of times what I found was most competition classes, especially from the pro team, I was finding was anywhere between an RPE of a 6 to an 8. And their duration was anywhere between 75 minutes to 90 minutes. So you can already imagine what the number of units of that is going to be. It's going to be really high. So when we had to train that second session for strength conditioning, I had to make sure that their number of training load units was below what they actually did for a BJJ practice, because I wanted to balance them out. Now, there are times when we are further away from competition, currently like we are in the off season right now, where I can kind of get it a little bit closer and match and kind of push some of that load to where we can see some really good adaptations while we're just hanging out and focusing on off season strength conditioning, as well as them getting back into shape for BJJ as they start moving into more competitions going into the next few months and into the new year. So again, this is nothing really crazy. You can actually track this over a 7-day period or however many days you train. And what ends up happening is at the end of the week, if you train for 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, or 7 days, you can then go ahead and take all of those numbers of units and add them together, and we'll go ahead and give you a total number of training units for that whole week, right? And then you can divide that by 7, and it'll give you your average training load for the week, which allows you to be like, okay, cool, that was a very high week. I might need a lower week coming into the next week. And this is something that I feel that a lot of people don't know how to do, is how to balance that high-low approach. Again, when I say a high-low approach, it doesn't mean that when you go into that low week that you're not training, you're not doing strength conditioning. You're just perceiving it as not as a hard session, meaning that mentally and physically you're cutting back a little bit of intensity because you know that you need to recover from the prior week. Again, stress is accumulative and it never stops accumulating. So we have to be able to relieve the stress bucket so that then we can go back the next week and hit it hard again, especially when we're coming up into competitions. We have to be very smart about that. And if we're going into a competition phase, that has to be very, very precise, meaning that we need to balance out training load on both ends of the spectrum. So when it comes down to that weekend of fighting, they have the energy, they have the mental wherewithal, they have all of that there to allow for them to perform at their best. And this is something that I've found work really well. And it actually has been very useful, not just for the athlete, but for me as a coach, especially when I'm writing training programs to see where I need to progress. And if I notice that they're perceiving a week a little bit more harder than I wanted them to, then I need to go ahead and make better decisions or better adjustments to their programming so that we can make that happen. Now, if it's a really low week already and they're saying, hey, this is really high, and they're just perceiving that, then that opens the door to ask more questions, meaning, hey, what's going on outside of the training program? Are you not sleeping well? You're not eating properly? Have you been traveling? Is there any stress going on outside of all of this? Because if that's the case, you're going to perceive the training session and the training and the training load as to be a little bit harder than it should be. So again, the more stress that we have on our system, the more we perceive something to be that much harder. And that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to relieve that so that we can maintain a consistent practice of strength conditioning and BJJ at the same time. And that's something that I've really been trying to hold true, is, hey, we shouldn't have to go through these peaks and valleys of doing training sessions. It needs to be this nice rolling waves of, you're going high, you're going low, you're going high, you're going low, you're going high, you're going low. So again, that's a big piece here that I like to talk about, is this idea of managing training load by utilizing the self-monitoring training load system. And if you have any questions on it, you guys can go ahead and send them right now, and we can talk a little about how we can approach this and how you can implement it to your training program. Come on, guys, at the dance. No one wants to do anything? Anthony, I'm going to call on you.
I was just about to unmute. Yeah, so I like this approach a lot. I have been using the Whoop this year for the first time. Really, really like it for recovery, for sleep, for kind of balancing out the day. However, if anybody's used it or has recommendations, it's pretty hard to wear during jiu-jitsu, where most of my intense training happens. So I'm lacking some good data on the strain. So I think this is a great method. I've used RP just in strength training before, but not to measure jiu-jitsu. So I'd be interested to see what kind of how you do it in terms of intensity wise to rate the scales. I'm pretty familiar with like lifting weights on what, hey, a 6 would be or a 7 would be. But maybe just your thoughts or somebody else's thoughts on how they use that to determine the intensity for jiu-jitsu sessions.
Right on. So that's a really good question, man. I think the way that I know that the way that I've utilized and approached that scaling system is based off the individual's training. So you can take that 10 and make it as competition level, right? So, hey, I'm at a 10 competition level. That's the intensity that you're at. And everything else below that starts to decrease, which I was saying, Felipe and those individuals that I've worked with who are doing competition style training have always dropped into that, at 6 to 8 range, because they're never really touching that high potential. They're playing around in that like threshold of like, okay, I'm touching it, but I'm pulling it back. I'm touching it, I'm pulling it back. So that's literally what I've done to go ahead and mimic that scale. So, one's being, recovery. I'm not doing anything. I might just be kind of rolling with my friends. It's not really going hard. And then 10 is going to be that competition setting type intensity. Does that answer your question, Anthony?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Anybody else have any questions on this?
Not necessarily a question. I thought of running the Whoop at one point on like the there's an arm sleeve to track it, but I just never got to doing it. I noticed it with myself in two places. One's a mental fog, but that's like the wrong way to say it. It'll feel like my brain's full. It feels like where my brain's trying to make a connection somewhere between like, I don't know, something universal and try to apply it to jiu-jitsu, and I'm seeing something, I can't quite put it together. It'll literally feel like my brain's full. Or the other way I notice it, and George, you might know the terminology for this. I forget. It's in the endurance world. There's something to where like once your heart rate hits a certain elevation and can't recover itself, I'll notice that during rolling if I'm overtaxed. It'll be like as soon as we start rolling, where the heart rate will really spike, and then it'll drop once you're done. But as soon as you start rolling it, it spikes right away versus kind of like a slow, gradual uphill slug and then kind of hold at a certain, and I don't have like data on this. This is just like what I feel in myself kind of thing. That's what I notice when I feel overtaxed.
That's a really good point. I think that has to come to your body temperature rising. So we've talked about this before from a heat aspect. Our body temperature gets to a certain point, especially when we're wearing our gi and we're inside of a room that potentially has very low airflow. Our body starts to overheat, meaning that our ability to recover in the aerobic system isn't kicking in as fast. So, most of the time we're doing 6 to 10 minute roll sessions with anywhere between a minute to 2 minute breaks. What ends up happening is that if you're rolling multiple times, let's say you roll 10 rolls in an hour session, 6 minutes on, 1 minute off, that 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th rolling session, that minute recovery is no longer valuable for you, meaning that potentially you might need to take a 2 to 3 minute recovery to let the aerobic system kick in. Because what ends up happening, it's very similar to tempo or threshold training, right? When I get endurance athletes to go ahead and get up to that heart rate, they're up that 150, 160 heart rate, right? And then I give them a 90-second, 2 minute recovery period. Automatically, the next thing they know, when they're on that next run, they're right back into that tempo and threshold. Now, that is a really good place to be when we're actually preparing for competition, because there is going to be times where you have to feel that and be able to work through that. And from a neurological standpoint, we know that complex skills and fine motor skills start to decrease as our heart rate starts to increase. So if we can go and teach our system to go ahead and apply certain techniques and skill sets while our heart rate's at that time period, meaning that we're learning to slow down, that's something that really helps out. Now, from a mental fog standpoint, of the ability to continue learning, I've noticed that as well. I'm pretty sure others have from doing this, is that if I'm doing jiu-jitsu 4 weeks in a row, meaning I'm doing 3 to 4 or 5 classes a week, I've done that before. Within that 4th week, and I didn't do any high-low approach, I realized that I couldn't consume any more information. I was confused. I was all over the place. My hands were doing crazy things. My feet were doing things. My ability to react was slowing down. So this is where the idea of neurological fatigue kicks in. And again, it goes across the board on everything, not just in jiu-jitsu. So that's where I really love utilizing the self-monitoring training load system, is because it allows for me to go ahead and know, like, all right, cool. For the past 3 days, my rolling sessions have been, quite high. Let's say at a 7 for 90 minutes, that's really high. That's what, 630 points, I believe, somewhere around there. I think I did the math right. And that's kind of high, right? And what I want to go and talk about is, if you hit those high numbers back to back to back, we start to see a decrease in recovery and we start to see an increase in exhaustion. So that's where implementing this type of load system from a feeling awareness actually helps us not hit those points of burnout or brain fatigue, or the heart rate's not being able to get back down to a recovery state. We're always at that working state and we're never getting out of that resistance phase. That answer your question, Ben?
Yeah.
Cool. Anybody else have any questions on this? No? Cool.
George, I know we've talked a little bit about HRV, and I know everyone's HRV is a lot different. That's one thing I do notice, obviously, with going into like a heavy exertion in a roll and then recovering the next day. What's your opinion on HRV? And I know that's very specific and probably broad person by person, right?
Yeah, dude. So I've been working with HRV since 2015. And if you guys want to find a really good educational company on HRV, look up Elite HRV. I'm not sponsoring them. They're not sponsoring me. I've just been able to work with them and utilize their platform and their approach to understanding what heart rate variability is. And at the end of the day, it's your ability to manage stress, right? So we know that sometimes you'll get numbers that are, hey, you're in the parasympathetic state at a readiness of a 9, or you're in a parasympathetic state at a readiness of a 1, or you're in a sympathetic state at a readiness of a 9, or you're in a sympathetic state in a readiness of a 1. Obviously, being on the two ends of the spectrum is not going to be good. You're just not recovering. You're not able to handle stress. So anything in that middle allows for us to handle stress. So this comes down to that, to your question now, Matt, is the fact that like when you go in a roll, right, you need to go ahead and do something afterwards that gets you out of that exhaustion phase right away. So remember when we were rolling out of the dungeon down in Draper and it was really hot inside there and you would see me go ahead and do like a cool down on the bike, or I was trying to do something to get the heart rate back down and the body temperature down as quickly as possible to get me back into that recovery state. It's something I still do today. And what I've been playing with is after I'm done doing a rolling session, about 10 minutes after I've cooled down and just kind of got myself back to a normal state, I'll jump in and do a cold plunge. And that cold plunge is only anywhere between 10 to 20 breaths. I'll get out and let my body recover. If you have a sauna, jump into the sauna for 10 to 20 breaths, jump back into the cold plunge for 10 to 20 breaths, and then get out and let your body naturally warm up on its own. Something with this I found is it helps me recover that much faster. So I'm able to see my resting heart rate actually get back to a baseline the next morning. My HRV is back to a normal state. And another big thing that a lot of people don't realize, but the factors that actually create a decrease or increase in HRV is also going to be what you're eating, how your body responds to that eating, how you're responding to stress outside of your training, how you're sleeping, how it comes into a lot of things come into play. So again, this idea that, you know, when we're using the Whoop or we're using Elite HRV or we're using any type of wearable or feedback wearable, what we're doing with that data is ultimately we're just trying to get ourselves back to that recovery state and back to a homeostasis so that we can go ahead and continue working hard again. So yeah, dude, after those hard training sessions in the evening time or whatever else, we've talked about this in the past, your recovery protocols need to be on point right away within like 90 minutes of that so that you can see that happen. And we talked, like I said, we talked about that. I remember we're telling you, hey, you need electrolytes, do some cold plunge stuff. And you have data on that from last year when we talked about that. You probably saw your recovery actually stay pretty well compared to when you didn't do it.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you.
Yeah, cool, man. Anybody have any other questions on this?
George, I had one quick question too to
Yeah,
think
go
about.
for it.
Do you have like data, or do you have like an idea, kind of like I guess like I know this will be a broad, maybe standard, but like, hey, you know, with the self-monitoring training load system, you know, for the week, this is, you know, if you hit this number, this is considered on average like a high amount of training or a low amount of training.
Yeah, dude, I actually do. So the way I like to break it down is super simple. Anything above 600 training units to 10,000 or to 1,000 is considered high. Anything between 300 to 600 is going to be considered moderate training. And then anything below 300 to 0 will be low.
Awesome, man. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries, dude. And that's a really good question, right? Because if we're training twice in a day, you have 2,000 number of units training load that you can reach, meaning that if you're going to do a strength conditioning session to the 10 and you hit this over 1,000, you obviously are really high in that training load. If you're doing, you know, let's say your BJJ practice comes out to being a 800, right? You know that your strength conditioning session for that day needs to be below 300 or below 200. And the idea there is I like to go ahead and keep everything within that 1,000 number of units for 2 training sessions. If we need to go a little bit over, that's fine, but I really try and keep everything within that 1,000 number, 1,000 training units, if that makes sense.
Yep, absolutely. Perfect. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries. You're welcome. Any more questions, guys, on this? And thanks for the interactive, guys. I appreciate it. This is awesome. Cool. Moving on. All right, so now talking about the high-low continuum. All right, so this here I've played around with this for a while, right? Like we've seen this curve before from power all the way down to endurance. We've seen it from a skill acquisition of different athletes on where they actually play into part with this. What I wanted to do was do something different. And if you guys all know, I like to go ahead and look for the differentials in this. And the idea here is at the very top of this graph or this continuum, you're going to have high stress, fine skills, open skills, and complex skills. The very end of this graph, you're going to go ahead and see low stress, growth skills, closed skills, and simple skills. Now, what affects all of those things is going to be the inputs of work, training, personal life, and demands of job. Now, you're probably wondering why I'm asking about demands of job and work. Well, I look at work in terms of just physical activity, right? Work is just physical activity, mental activity, how much we're doing. And then the demands of the job is going to be the rigor that you have to put into it from a physical or mental aspect. So again, those two are a little bit different from a training perspective. You know, how much are you training? What does that put you at? Are you going to go ahead and be bouncing back and forth when you utilize that training session? And then your personal life, right? So if you notice, we have multiple little dots here, and the way we can input this, right, is like, let's say at our BJJ practice right now is focused around getting ready for competition setting. Well, we know that it's going to be high stress when we're rolling. We know that our fine motor skills are potentially going to be used, as well as those open skills, as well as those complex skills, because we're trying to go ahead and put together pieces together. And we're really, really pushing the mental and physical stress on that end. Now, what does that mean? Well, everything else that we're doing outside of that training needs to be down towards the low stress. Make sure that we're touching some of those gross motor skills, some of those closed skills and simple skills to help relieve the high stress that we're doing. Now, another big piece that we can look at from this is going to be, all right, well, my personal life right now is in a high stress state, meaning that maybe I need to focus on doing my jiu-jitsu practice at a lower stress state, meaning that I'm focusing more on simple skills and I'm doing those types of things, as well as maybe my job is being super stressful. So I need to go ahead and balance that out. And I heard this from a really, really well-known endurance athlete. His name is Cam Wash. He's an Aussie, and he talked about this idea that, you know, if you don't have everything in place coming from a support structure of family and friends to give you what you need, if your training is not there, if your work is not there and your personal life's not there and the demands of your job are quite high, then it's kind of hard to really train at the level that you want to train at. So you have to learn, again, this is that feeling awareness, knowing when to implement hard training blocks, when not to put in hard training blocks, when to implement low stress training blocks, and actually implement skills and technique. And the way I'm going to use that is, for example, right now, obviously everyone knows, as I walked away from Soflete in June, I was training for a 100-mile race. And I had to step away from it because of the energy that I needed to put into that race was being taken away from having to start the business, having to get things together, and just honestly mental stress. So I had to go ahead and be like, all right, let's go ahead and put that on the back burner for now. And let's go ahead and find another balance that I can go ahead and still maintain my physical, mental conditioning, as well as my quality of life, because I know that I need to train. And I just love to train. I mean, outside of competing, I just love to train. Right. I have no races on the board right now. I have no big competitions coming up. I'm supposed to be competing on August 5th for jiu-jitsu. But realistically, I'm not putting everything into the bucket. I'm kind of managing everything across the board on this high-low continuum based on the day. So for example, sometimes my personality is I'll catch these waves of creativity and I'm like high and I want to do things. And all of a sudden I'll kind of start going down into this dip where I just need to like rest, recover, and let my body recover. And what I'm finding with that is the moments where I actually can train a little bit more, because I'm not putting so much mental energy into doing things for the business or being creative or whatnot. So for example, I'm kind of in that low right now, especially because I'm teaching today. So the past 2 days, I've just been focusing on just kind of getting the body prep so I can have a good conversation, so I can keep the mind fresh. And I went for a 2-hour run yesterday in 95-degree weather, and I had to focus on proper heat acclimation, hydration stuff. Today was a swim day. Tomorrow will be jiu-jitsu. But I look at yesterday as a high day. Today was a low day. Tomorrow will be a high day because I will be training pretty hard in the jiu-jitsu, in a jiu-jitsu practice, as well as a strength conditioning day. So if you notice, I had a high day, low day, high day. And this is something that I want to talk about utilizing this high-low continuum, is how to approach your training sessions and your days from a high-low approach, meaning that you can go ahead and understand that some days are going to demand you to work really, really hard and be really high stress. They're going to cause you to go ahead and implement those fine motor skills, those open skills, and those complex skills, as well as there's going to be days where you need low stress stuff. So again, this continuum is very personal. Again, if you notice, a lot of this conversation has been around the individual and how you apply it to yourself and how you can actually apply it to others that you're working with. So again, I don't want to get too down into the weeds of this, because like I said, we could go ahead and probably hammer out a bunch of stuff. And I'd rather hear your guys' take on what it is you guys look at when you read this presentation in terms of the high-low continuum and how you would actually implement it into your day. Cool. Anybody have any questions? No one? If we're confused on it or whatever else, let's dive into it and talk about it. But if not, we can move on.
What do you define as open skills?
So the open skills is going to be less of being taught how to do something and more of applying what you've actually learned over the past few months or few weeks. Does that make sense? So closed skills are going to be more in a closed setting to where you're being taught how to do things. And that open skill aspect is going to be more in a higher stress environment, such as a sparring session or a rolling session.
Gotcha. So like an opportunity for more variability and fatigue.
Correct.
I got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, no worries, dude. Anybody have any other questions? No? Cool. Moving on. All right, so the regeneration engine. So this is something that I really stoked about because it's something that I've actually really emphasized a lot with individuals so that they can continue training really hard. Now, the regeneration engine is going to come down to one is going to be the nervous system, the heart, muscles, and joints. So for example, a lot of individuals in jiu-jitsu deal with a lot of joint pain, elbows, hips, back, shoulders, neck. A lot of individuals have a really shitty heart health, excuse my language, but they have really poor heart health, as well as their nervous system is not actually balanced. So what do we need to do to go ahead and improve their ability to actually perform and actually get out of pain and actually remove the brain fog or that neurological fatigue and that physical fatigue that we see on the system? And again, if everyone doesn't know this, but the heart is a muscle, right? So then the great thing about that is if you're utilizing HRV or if you're utilizing resting heart rate monitoring, you'll notice that if you do a really hard training session, let's say on a Monday, your heart won't actually respond to that until until 2 days later. So it's like delayed on muscle soreness for the heart. And I think that's a piece that a lot of people don't realize is that's the reason why I like to talk a lot about the high-low approach is because if I train really hard on a Monday and I do a low session, meaning I keep my heart rate lower, my intensity, my load is lower, I actually improve my recovery rate so that when it comes back on that next day on a Wednesday, my resting heart rate isn't so drastically increased by the amount of training that I put onto it. I've actually had the ability to do that. Now, the same thing with the nervous system. One thing I've learned, and it goes back to what Ben talked about, is like I have this brain fog where I can't consume information anymore. I can't learn. That's just part of the learning process and our ability to consume information. So the way I like to look at it is like I have this ninja knife, and my ninja knife has all this blood on it from utilizing it and working. I need to give time to go ahead and clean it off and remove all of that stuff around that knife so that I can go back into the fight, so that I can learn. So the idea there is to go ahead and stop taking input, meaning stop learning, stop taking the skills in that moment and start actually doing more output type stuff, more applying the things that you've learned, because the same exact thing as when we're writing a lot, we get the things out of our systems. It allows for us to relieve that stress. Which at the same time, if we go ahead and do that, we activate the parasympathetic state, which then promotes recovery from a physical standpoint in terms of the muscles and the joints. So what does a regeneration engine or a regeneration session look like? Well, that's as simple as, you're going into the gym and the intention is to focus on regenerating, meaning that, hey, I'm not in here to go ahead and try and sustain or develop any kind of skills or improve my heart health or add more muscle or more pain to the system. What I'm focusing on is actually promoting recovery. And that can be as simple as some breathing work, some movement flow, some easy bike riding, maybe a swim, and maybe some, like Ben talked about, some of the, the joint stuff, extended ranges on the joint, focusing on more local movement type stuff that's going to go ahead and keep the stress really, really, really low. And we see this across the board in all sports. I think it's just not happening as much in the BJJ world as we need to see. So for example, right after Worlds, a lot of the individuals that I got to work with and coach, after that world competition, we went into a 4-week regen phase. And that regen phase focused on improving recovery and getting everyone out of pain and letting them mentally recover from the year to 16 to 20 to 12 to 4 to 8 to however many hard weeks of training they did leading into competition. And that's what the regeneration engine actually is used for. So again, the idea for this regeneration engine isn't to just go ahead and stack more stress on. It's actually to go ahead and be the tool that unlocks the pressure to go ahead and release stress. So that is something that I like to utilize a lot when it comes to blending in a strength and conditioning practice or routine into the BJJ world, is this idea of how to regenerate. And I think the BJJ world is quite behind in the strength and conditioning routine and how we blend it in. And I think if we're going to go ahead and be consistent with adding in a strength conditioning routine into a BJJ practice, we have to really take in consideration the idea of the regeneration engine. And if we don't, this is where we start to see a decrease in performance, quality of life starts to decrease. We start to see stress increase and our exhaustion phase actually increase. And our stress is actually going to be that much higher because now we're not recovering, meaning that our tolerance to stress is less than it would be if we were recovering properly. We have any questions on the regeneration engine? No, cool. Moving on. All right, so one of the last slides here is going to be improved recovery rate. So I like using graphs. And if you see here, we have a graph where it has on the left side of it says empty for a gas tank and then full. So if you notice, I have a legend here, stress is going to be the S, E is going to be exhaustion, and then recovery is going to be the R. And if you notice, the more stress that we are putting into the system, the more that we see the exhaustion start to rise, and we actually start to see the recovery rate decrease. So this is the idea where we have to understand how to manage stressors. And again, this comes back down to the high-low continuum. And if we're putting in stressors that are going to go ahead and continue having us increase in terms of the tank being full of stress, well, then guess what ends up following behind is that exhaustion, and the recovery starts to decrease, becoming empty. And the idea is to go ahead and maintain at least a half cup to a 3/4 cup of recovery so that we can get back to the state of fighting, to the state of training as we need to. Again, this can be applied to anything and everything. This can be applied to endurance athletes, can be applied to your fitness enthusiasts. This can be applied to the BJJ world. This can be applied to CrossFitters. This can be applied to weightlifters. You name it. It's all based around stress. You can put any kind of stressors in here and you'll see that this happens across the board for everything. And you might understand this as super compensation. But at the end of the day, if we start to see that our exhaustion rate is still getting really high and we start noticing small stressors are starting to bother us, then that's probably a huge indicator that our recovery rate is not high enough to allow for us to be doing what we're doing. And we have to implement some kind of regeneration session, regeneration week, or a block as a whole. So again, that's where you have to go ahead and start tying everything in together. And that's where the self-load training monitoring system comes into play, meaning that if my stress is at a 600, 600, 600, 3 times in a row, well, my exhaustion is going to go ahead and increase because my recovery rate is not there, meaning that time in exhaustion is a lot longer than I want it to be, meaning that it's decreasing my ability to recover, meaning it's lowering my homeostasis every single time I add more stress to it. And again, that's where that idea of brain fog, neurological fatigue, the ability to not recover is going to happen. So this is another big piece that I like to highlight and showcase because I think, again, not many people understand how to approach this or what it actually really means when we actually stack on stress, and we're never recovering from it. All right. So what I want you guys to do, since you guys have partaked in this conversation and over the next, week or 3 weeks, what I want y'all to start doing is building your own self-monitoring training load system. And what that means is you're going to go ahead and start monitoring that. And I'll go ahead and email out a self-monitoring system paper that you can do, or you can do it on your own, but you'll go ahead and track it over the next 3 weeks and see how you're actually handling it. And what this is going to help you do is it's going to be able to develop a baseline of how you feel and how you're actually responding to your BJJ practice and your strength conditioning practice at the same time. And from there, you can start playing around with adjusting certain training loads, actually being more intentful when you go into training for a BJJ practice, knowing that, hey, if I'm training 4 days in a row, maybe 3 days back to back of hard roll sessions isn't probably smart. Maybe out of those 4 days of rolling, I do 2 hard training sessions and 2 low stress training sessions, and I can go ahead and blend in the strength conditioning pieces of that as well. Another big piece here is you might find that you might implement a strength conditioning session on a low training day for BJJ and ends up becoming another high day. So what I like to recommend is stacking high days on high days and low days with low days. Again, if we're going to give it to it, let's give it to it. Let's give the system and the mind and everything what it needs. And then let's give it a day to recover. Again, we're being very intentional and very attentive with what we're doing when we apply this approach. So if you guys have any questions on this, let me know. But this is something I want you all to go ahead and play around with and implement and try with it so we can keep this conversation going. So the next class we have on this, we can actually talk about what it is, the numbers we're seeing, how we can go ahead and add in new recovery techniques, and what it is actually we're doing with the recovery, with the data numbers that we're seeing that are being plotted, as well as what is the wearables and how do we actually implement the wearable data to allow for us to navigate the training load system that much more accurate. Any questions on this? All right, moving on, guys. Now, this is the last slide of the class. Let's go ahead and have an open discussion on everything. Again, we don't want to take too much time, but let's go ahead and talk a little about what we've taken into this and how it's helped you guys, or how you can approach and apply this to your practice or your athlete's practice.
George, I thought this was great, man. I really appreciate it. The only other question I had, you may have said this and I might have missed it when I was asking about kind of your standards for high, moderate, and low on the total. Was that for, you said 1,000 was kind of the threshold. Was that for the day or for the week?
For the day.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. So for example, I did a case study back in 2021 with 15 tactical professionals, and I applied this training load system to them. And over a week period, I saw up to 2,700 units. I'm sorry, 27,000 units over a 7-day period from a tactical professional standpoint, meaning that their stress from their job was so high that it was causing this extraordinary number from a week total that we had to then apply stress management techniques to lower it. So for example, we had one individual who was in work for 9 to 10 hours, and their perception towards their stress of work was at like a 7 or 8 throughout the whole week. And they had some high extraordinary numbers. So we were like, holy cow. And then we had some numbers that were in the 13,000s to where it was very balanced. So again, it's a very I guess it would be a very subjective approach to how you would monitor this, because it becomes very individual, right? Like you might notice that one week is really high over 7-day period, and then one week might be really low. And then you might see another week might be in between. And then the next week you might see something in between that moderate load for a week and then that low load for the week. You'll start seeing that it just kind of plots everywhere. And you can actually go back and be like, oh, that makes sense. Well, I was stressed because of work and my job and the family and the kids weren't sleeping, but I was still training, and that's how I perceived it. Oh, this week I was actually eating correctly and there was no craziness at work. I was able to train really well and I was able to have this going on. So my perception to stress and training and everything around me from an external standpoint, as well as internal, allowed for me to go ahead and have a lower amount of units per the week. And then let's say the following week happens. So what it does is it just starts to build this big picture for you to understand how you're actually reacting to stress from a physiological and a psychological standpoint.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Anybody else have any questions? Anybody want to add to the top of add anything to this as well? No? Word. Well, guys, I guess that concludes my my class on blending strength conditioning routine into a BJJ practice. Again, like I said, I didn't want this to be focused around, hey, reps, sets, energy system progressions. How do we go ahead and get someone to do X, Y, and Z that leads to Y? It was more of how do we go ahead and be consistent with maintaining a strength conditioning routine as well as a BJJ practice. And I think this is the big missing piece here, is this ability to recover and regenerate between the sessions when you're not doing them, and actually build a awareness around how you are actually responding and reacting and adapting to the training load stimulus into your everyday lifestyle. So again, I appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for that. Again, I will be putting this up onto the YouTube page, as well as I'll be sending it out via newsletter. So if you have anybody that would actually benefit from listening to this, please send it out and get it to them, as well as the website's being built right now. We're on the back end of it. We're adding some really cool things. from here on out, or not from here on out, but as we continue doing these live free classes, it's going to be actually put underneath the active learning group. So if you want to become a part of the active learning group, you'll go ahead and also see an email with that and exactly what that is. And the active learning group is going to be really cool. It's going to be focused around a very online classroom setting, meaning that, hey, every week there's going to be a new DQ question. There's going to be conversations. There's going to be updated videos. I'm going to be talking about different things and throwing my mind and the education experience and knowledge that I have onto that active learning group so everyone can learn. Again, that is something that I'm really, really passionate about, is educating others. Again, like I said, I don't want to be able to be programming or working with individuals forever. I believe that we need to educate them, give them their autonomy and individuality, and give them that curiosity and humanity back from a standpoint of how to go ahead and live a healthy lifestyle. So again, this is where GB3 Athletics is going. We're still going to be doing remote online coaching one-on-one. We're going to be offering blog programming that's going to be focused around the GPP individuals, as well as I'm going to be doing a BJJ specific training program as well from the blog perspective. So again, keep your eyes out, guys, and I appreciate the support and actually being on here live on a Tuesday morning at 10:30. Our individuals on the East Coast in the afternoon. Again, I appreciate the support, and again, it means a lot. And we're only starting this. This is only the beginning of what's to come, and I'm super excited about sharing more in depth.
Thanks, George. This is awesome.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate your time today.
George, thank you, man. Yeah, it was great. Appreciate you.
Yeah, dude, for sure. Awesome. Thanks, guys. Cool. Ryan, what's up, dude?
Dude, that was awesome.
Thanks, buddy. We're not recording anymore. If you guys still want to jump on, we can still chat for a little bit if you guys want to. I got about 15 minutes if you want to hang out.
Yeah.
All right. Well, since we're off camera now, how can I be better?
How can you be better?
What are the problems we saw in this, and how can we fix it?
I don't know. I mean, it was really well organized.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
You've definitely taught it before.
So what's funny, man, is this go for it, Anthony. You got something?
Oh no, I thought it was great. I think just having background knowledge on the things you were talking about made me able to take a lot more out of it from what you were talking about. Maybe somebody who has no experience with strength and conditioning might have found it a little overwhelming. But man, I thought it was killer. I think people that are going to come to you already kind of have an understanding or are, at least somewhat versed in the game of strength and conditioning. But I thought you did a really good job, man. Even if I didn't know, of like breaking it down and explaining, hey, bottom line, this is what you need to know. But yeah, it was good.
Nice, dude. Appreciate that. Phil, you have anything, bro? He's in a text back.
So, no, I'm good. Biggest thing is the way you defined strength and conditioning for the sport of BJJ, because it's really different. Beside when you couple strength and conditioning with any other discipline, whether it's tactical, BJJ, or anything else, it needs to serve that purpose. If it's not serving the purpose of enhancing that sport or discipline, it's not doing anything for the athlete. So that, and then coupled with building awareness in your athletes through education, and whether it's HRV monitors, heart rate monitors, or your own system that you've with the RPE scale, over time they'll have those feelings of like, yeah, that was a high-low day, or that was too much, my intensity, because I was trying to learn a new skill that is too much stress for me because I was trying to learn something new in this day. Which we could all, when you're trying to learn something that is high stress, especially if you're new to an environment, you're trying to, like, all the things that go along with showcasing your skill, you want to perform at your highest level. Those are all stressors, and it's all fun and games until you're tapped out and your heart rate's 160 and you're hyperventilating before you even start doing the thing you're supposed to do.
Yeah, no kidding. I think that's a big piece that I was trying to convey, like, especially during that high-low continuum. And Ryan, you asked that question on it. And I think that close skill can also increase to a high stressor. So I guess I would say, like, a lot of those things can vary based on, perception to the environment. I guess that's a really good piece that we can add to that, is the idea of, like, how do we respond to the environment, especially, You know, we all work with different individuals. We come from different backgrounds. How do we respond in those environments, right? Like, I know what it feels like to step on a mat, getting ready to fight someone you have no idea about, but you've done it plenty of times. It's just in that environment. So it causes a lot of responses from an internal standpoint. I think that's a big piece. I need to add into it or make that a different conversation, I guess you would say.
Yeah, probably. And because you could even add the critical thinking and problem solving.
Yeah.
Like how much of it is needed. Like when you're rolling and practicing skills in your gym is different than when you're doing it for real, because it's actually, you're responding to someone else. Yes, you may doing it at a certain rate, but like the requirement for critical thinking and problem solving at a rapid rate is a lot greater when you're doing it against something that is unknown. You've never met this athlete before. You don't know what he likes to do for anything, because you're new. So I think, yeah, the critical thinking problem solving could go in that top end versus the low end. It's you know what's going to be coming, and you can react to it in a known pattern.
Yeah. It's very similar to war fighting, right? Like, how many times are we on the shooting range or we're in a CQB room? The stress for that's a little bit different compared to actually doing it in a real life setting where you're kicking a door and knowing that there's potentially fucking talibs in the back room there that you're gonna have to take down, right? That's the same idea. The stressor is no different. The way I look at it.
Yeah, I think that.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. Go ahead.
I was going to say, do you guys have an onboarding process for new people?
Like new athletes? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, not so much you, George, on the strength and conditioning side, but from a jiu-jitsu side.
Dude, like an onboarding, do you know, he knew we'd ask that question, he got off, but Ben's actually trying to develop like a remote online one-on-one teaching individuals from a remote standpoint, jiu-jitsu practice.
Well, so what I was thinking was doing even like a format like this, but understanding the stress of, or like balancing the stress of jiu-jitsu, where it's like, you're breaking down each type of session. Like if it's an easy day, a hard day, what can you do to better counteract it? Yeah. Like if it's a hard rolling session, well, you could spend 10 minutes on a bike doing some easy nasal breathing. So like a balancing of, energy or stress or whatever it is, and give that to new people coming in.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I haven't developed a template on that. I think it's more of a strength conditioning template where it's like, hey, these are the number of high days you should do per week. Here's the number of low days you do per week. And then here's a number of regeneration days you can do per week. I think that's a really good point to do from a BJJ practice. It's a conversation I had with one of the guys that's competing over at Del Mar. He was like, hey, how many high days should I be trying to really get ready for a competition? I was like, well, you got to look at it very much from a sports specific standpoint, as well as a general physical preparedness standpoint, right? The further you are from competition, the more general you will be, meaning that you don't need to have as many high days or many exposures to that stress in competition. And then when we get into that sports specific block, we have to go ahead and expose the system to higher stressors, faster paces, harder rolling. And I think that's a piece that you're right, that a lot of people don't know how to manage. I think it's just stated that we have to go hard every single time. And again, that's where I feel that BJJ realistically is like 15 years behind the curve, dude, when it comes to like understanding stress in terms of like how to handle in fights.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you can go even simpler. Like you're thinking about it from like a super, super high level, but how do you take like the general population is relatively deconditioned, right? Like most of the people walking in the door for the first time don't even need something that high level. And it's like, you just got like every session you go in, you're more than likely just getting your ass kicked for the most part, right? Like whether it's mentally, emotionally, or physically. Now, what can you do to counteract that before you get in your car and drive home, right? So it's like you explaining a breathing practice post-session or recovery protocols to bring them back to that homeostatic recovery state before they take off for the day. And because I think it's a top-down approach from the educators of the facility, right?
Yes.
So you guys make the precedent and then everyone kind of falls in line because it's a priority for you.
Yeah. So that's a really good point. That's actually, I'm going to be teaching that at Crown BJJ actually. is going
Cool.
to be a cool down protocol, or how do we go ahead and cool down after a hard training session? Because it's the same conversation I had with Matt. Those are the conversations we were having when I used to live out there. Was, you know, we fought in this dungeon, bro, where it was just balls hot all the time, especially during the summer. And it was, how do we recover from, one, losing so much stress or sweat, as well as heart rate being through the roof, as well as, like you said, physically and mentally taxed. What do we need to do? And a lot of that came down to, hey, jump on the bike, nasal breathe for 10 minutes, do a stretching protocol. And then if you have time, do some breathing work. And then even went further than that. When you got home, within this 90-minute window, here are the things that you should be applying to it. And then within a 120-minute window, here's what you should be doing. So it went from when you got done all the way to 120 minutes to being complete. And that's something that I'm actually going to be talking about at that seminar, actually, is going, how do we go ahead and recover so we can do that? Because I mean, realistically, man, like we could be able to recover really fucking well after a BJJ session, thinking about how we're moving, our muscles are nice and warmed up, dude. Like if you have some, you know, let's say you have some limitations in the way we move, that's a really good time to actually hammer those home, right? Give them a movement flow session to actually improve that. So yeah, that's
Del Mar is such a unique facility, is you can walk off the mat straight into the gym, right? Or like you could essentially even bring the bikes over, and in between rolls, you could have people on the bikes being like, all right, you're gonna recovery spin for the next 3 minutes, and like actually teach people how to recover.
So it's really cool you say that, because that, if I had my own physical location of a BJJ dojo and a performance gym, guess where bikes would be? There would be bikes on the mat, by the mat,
100%.
and there'd be bikes inside the gym because of that. Because I've actually thought about doing that with Felipe and them, but I don't go to train. I don't go to their competition gym, right? Is like, hey, roll and then jump on the bike and do this thing, right? Or like whatever else. So I that is, again, thinking outside the box and being like, how do we have these individuals recover between it? Because again, like same thing, right? I did a training session in the pool today. It was 3 rounds increasing pace of a 500-meter swim, 3 minutes treading.
Love it.
Right. And again, all we're doing is teaching the system how to recover from an aerobic standpoint while still slowly moving. Utilizing oxygen, refreshing the system out, and doing that. And it's the same thing, dude. I get to jump out of after I'm done doing a rolling session, I go straight to the cold plunge, like I said.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So I don't know if you heard me talk about it, but I said, like, when I get done with the open mat session, or if I'm doing a training session, once I'm done, depending on how I'm feeling, I'll go jump in that cold plunge for 10 to 20 breaths, get out, and either we don't have a sauna, so it's usually sunny out. So I'll get out, do a body temp, like lay there, breathe, literally lay on the floor and breathe for 10 to 20 breaths to the nose, jump back into the cold plunge and do that again twice. Dude, when I don't do it, my recovery's crap. I feel like shit, like my body's super stiff. And when I do implement it and do it, night and day difference. I'm able to like just get right back at it.
I like it.
Yeah, dude. So yeah, those are things that I'll be teaching down at Crown BJJ.
Cool.
And hopefully we can go to other gyms and teach this stuff too, man. That's the goal.
For sure.
So yeah.
I like it.
Yeah, dude. Thanks for
Good
showing
deal,
up,
man.
man. Thanks for
good.
for hanging out. Phil, thanks,
Sure.
thanks, man. Appreciate it, dude.
Phil's gone.
Nope. No problem. I'm having difficulties from forward in time. So
Nice, dude.
it's nighttime. I'll see you guys on the next one.
Yes, dude. Appreciate you, brother. Laters, dude. Laters, Ryan.
All right, man. I'll see you later.
How you feeling, dude? Actually, hold on, me and